The big turnout. My name is James Hu. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the Museum of Chinese in America, and I'm joined here today by our wonderful colleagues and my wife, Joanne. Before we start, I want to give a big shout out to our president, Mike Lee, who is standing behind there. And my fellow trustee, Jun Ji, she's here. And Chang Sito, without whom our event would not be possible. Thank you so much for organizing this for us. Great. As we mark the end of the AAPI month in May, we thought we'd host this event to illuminate a very important chapter in the American history and explore the challenges faced by Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. At MOCA, our mission focuses on exploring and celebrating the richness and diversity of the Chinese American experience. And in connection with that, also fostering a broader understanding of the general AAPI community. So we're hosting this event today to explore some very deep topics, and we have the distinct pleasure of welcoming the NBC Congressional Reporter, Scott Wong. Yep. Thank you, Scott. And I'm sure with your journalistic acumen and your commitment to truth-telling, we'll have a very insightful conversation tonight. Scott, maybe I will now turn it over to you for you to introduce our other distinguished guests. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to have our panelists come on up to the stage here as I am making introductions. Thank you to Michael, to the board of directors here at the museum, to the museum itself and all of its members. I met Michael just a month ago at the C100, Committee of 100 Gala, and we had discussed doing something for AANHPI Heritage Month, and that this event was born out of that conversation just a month ago. So I'm very excited that it came to fruition and that his team was able to pull it together so quickly. We have a stellar panel here with us tonight, and all of these individuals are people that I have covered for many, many years, chasing them down the halls of Congress or in the administration. They know me quite well and have had to deal with me for many, many years, but we are grateful for them to be here. They really need no introduction, but I'm going to say a few remarks about each of them. Grace Meng, here in the center, represents Queens right here in New York City. She is the member of the Powerful Appropriations Committee. In case you don't know, it controls the purse strings of the federal government. And she is a former top official at the Democratic National Committee and the first Asian American elected to Congress from right here in the state of New York. Congressman Mark Takano represents Riverside in Southern California. He is the top Democrat on the Veterans Affairs Committee. He is the former chairman of that committee, and if things go his way, he will be the chairman once again come 2025. He is a former longtime teacher and educator and previously served on the Riverside Community College's Board of Trustees. In 2012, he made history as the first openly gay person of color to be elected to Congress. And last but not least, Chris Liu, my good friend and somebody I've known for many years. Chris Liu is the ambassador and the United States representative to the United Nations for management and reform. He leads negotiations on the UN budget and coordinates oversight of UN programs. Ambassador Liu served as legislative director and acting chief of staff for then Senator Obama, and then went on to serve as Obama's cabinet secretary and deputy labor secretary. Okay. Okay, before we begin, just a short disclaimer. None of us up here are historians, although I think all of us would consider ourselves students of history, like many of you all. And secondly, the topic that we are discussing tonight, the history of racism and discrimination against the AANHPI community, spans decades and decades and generations. And this discussion tonight is not meant to be all-encompassing, but I think a starting point for us to continue those conversations as we go forward. So just keep that in mind. Preparing for tonight's panel, this phrase that I've been hearing throughout AAPI Heritage Month, Asian American history is American history. Asian American history is American history. It makes me think about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, where the first major law barring a specific nationality from immigrating to the United States, and how that law was debated in the very halls of Congress where Grace Meng and Mark Takano now serve. It makes me think of the Japanese incarceration during World War II. And my question, I guess, is if Grace Meng and Mark Takano were serving in the Congress during those periods, would anything be different at all? Or would things have just gone on in the exact same way? My question to you guys, that's a pretty tough question, but my question to Mr. Takano and Grace Meng is, what does it mean now to have AANHPI people in leadership positions as issues are being discussed that are impacting our community? Either one of you guys want to take that question?
Well, I can tell you that.
Can we, I think your microphone may not be on.
Well, just, during World War II, there were no AAPIs in public office, no one in the Congress, no one of any consequence in the executive branch of the government. And the difference between having no representation and representation now is, there were 125, 130,000, Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants that were put into incarceration camps. The passage of the, Chinese Exclusion Act. The difference is like night and day. I mean, with representation, when acts of anti-Asian violence started to erupt, Grace Meng and Senator Hirono got into action, and they passed a bill on Asian hate crimes. That representation mattered. So, it's a cliche that if you don't have a seat at the table, meaning representation, you're off in the menu. And this is definitely what happened to AANHPI people.
Yeah, I wanted Chairman Takano to answer it first, because he says that a lot even in closed door meetings when this topic comes up. He often mentions how there were no members of Congress that look like us and came from our communities to kind of speak up if bills like this were proposed or executive orders. And we've seen this in variations, maybe to a lesser scale, with, sorry if this is a future question, but with, for example, these alien land laws that are being proposed, whether in states or in Congress, or in our case, oftentimes through unnoticed amendments in our Appropriations Committee. And sometimes that's come up, and I am probably one of the few members, sometimes on both sides of the aisle, who speak up and say, this amendment's not okay. And I quickly will text some of my fellow KPAC members to let them know what's going on. And this has happened in other committees, and we keep each other in the loop. And our chairwoman, Judy Chu, and KPAC will put out a statement and say, this amendment is not okay, please vote against it. And that's sort of the behind-the-scenes strategy that obviously did not or could not exist because there was no one that looked like us back then.
Yeah, and can I just follow up, Ms. Meng? You described sometimes being the only Asian American on a committee, or the only one who's in a position in a particular room or a meeting to speak up. Is that a lonely place? How, do you have to sort of like get yourself psyched up to say, okay, like I'm the only one here who can do this, who can speak up, and it has to be me?
Actually, I'm trying to think. I am the only Asian on our Appropriations Committee, and I sort of took the place, it's not direct trade, but I sort of took the place of former Congressman Mike Honda, who was on Appropriations. And when there was a vacancy, when Mike left Congress, there really weren't many people saying, oh yeah, we need someone who's Asian on that committee to represent our communities. And I won't give names of who didn't speak up when these alien land law amendments were being proposed, but I will say that members like Lauren Underwood and Susie Lee from Nevada, Susie's not Asian, but her last name's Lee, those two reliably stand up for our community.
Chris, let me turn to you as the son of Chinese immigrants, and you can explain to the audience your family's migration through Taiwan to the United States. But as a son of Chinese immigrants and somebody who has served in all three branches of government, including the judicial branch, how do you think about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882? And obviously we're talking about centuries ago, but the fact that it stayed on the books for decades and decades, that it survived legal challenges and certainly prevented thousands and thousands of people from being able to immigrate to the United States and maybe for some, or probably for many, being reunited with their families.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Scott, I want to thank you for moderating and just give you some props because I think that ties into the question. If you go around the corner, I just saw it, you can see the photo of the Golden Spike when they finished the Transcontinental Railroad. We just commemorated the 155th anniversary of that. Go take a look at that photo again. Not a single Asian face in that photo, even though we know that the Chinese railroad workers were the ones that did the most difficult task on the Western span. And I say that about Scott because we need not only people representing our communities in Congress, we need people telling the stories. A generation ago, you would have probably counted on one or two hands the number of Asian American journalists. And when we do the event before the Correspondents' Dinner now to honor Asian American journalists, there's hundreds, it seems like. And Scott is really one of the leaders. So part of it is telling the stories of our community. But specifically to that question, you know, I think about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and you could draw a straight line from that to Japanese American internment, to Vincent Chen, to the former president using the phrase China virus, Kung flu. And we know that in this country, despite the gains that we have made, that in times of economic crisis, in times of tension with other countries, our community is scapegoated. So I think that's an important lesson and message for all of us as we approach this very difficult period of time right now where tensions between the United States and China are growing. As Grace said, you've got these alien land laws that are coming up. And I think, to me, it's a sign that we need to be vigilant.
Mm-hmm. Do either of you guys want to say anything about Chinese exclusion?
So the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was certainly a racist, heinous piece of legislation. But it's layered on top of the first Immigration Act of 1790, which people don't know this, but for most of the existence of the United States, there was no possibility for any Asian immigrant to naturalize as a citizen. So while in 1882 they restrict immigration, we know that there was immigration of Asians, Chinese, before 1882, but there was no chance that those immigrants could ever become citizens. It wasn't until a court case, and Chris is, I think, the lawyer here, I can't remember the name, but it was after the Civil War amendments made clear that there was such a thing as birthright citizenship. They didn't, the reformers after the Civil War wanted to make sure that there was no way that a black person could be construed to not be a citizen. That was the central thesis behind the Dred Scott case. But it wasn't clear until a person of Chinese descent who was born here had his case adjudicated before the courts, and it wasn't until the later 1800s that this was done, to say, well, yeah, you could be born here as a Chinese person, and the Constitution applied to you, not just black people, right? So think about that. For most of the existence of the United States, your forebears from Asia could not become citizens. There was no possibility. The only way an Asian person could become a citizen was to be born here, and even then it wasn't until after the 1800s. And this would not change significantly until 1952. So my grandfather, my Issei grandfather, the first generation grandfather, who when he immigrated at age 18, I think, gosh, this must have been like 1916, around there, he wouldn't be eligible for citizenship for most of his life in the United States. I call him the original dreamer, right? And as a teacher, I taught a lot of Latino kids, and they would feel like giving up. Like, well, why should I work so hard? Why should I get good grades if I don't know that I'm going to have a place in this country, if I can't go to get scholarships and I can't qualify for certain grants? And I said, well, just keep trying. Don't give up. And I tell the story of my grandfather and how he came here, you know, very uncertain, and he spent some of that time in internment. But I tell you this larger history because, yes, the 1882 Exclusion Act was horrible, but even more horrible, it's layered on top of the embedded prejudice and discrimination against Asian people generally. And this history existed for most of the existence of our country.
They've done a great job. I'll just add one thing. These alien land laws that are being proposed, they are, and our Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries uses this phrase, they are essentially Chinese Exclusion Act 2.0, preventing people of Chinese descent or whose families are from one country singled out of any country around the world from buying a home. Or buying agricultural land where Secretary Vilsack, Ag Secretary, had said Chinese own less than 1% of farmland in the United States, and it's not an issue. It's a version of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
let me just take a step back and explain what we're talking about with these alien land laws. Now these are passed by state legislatures around the country, banning Chinese citizens and Chinese businesses from purchasing land in the United States in specific states like Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota. And so the argument from mostly Republican legislatures is that there's a national security issue. What is the counterpoint to that argument that this is about protecting the homeland and about national security?
So they've tried this on our Appropriations Committee. I said, fine, then ban any foreign country or persons to buy any agricultural land. If you really care about national security, maybe you can add countries like Iran, North Korea. They're not interested in that. They're only interested in China. And it's also states like Florida, and I forget the details, but Georgia just passed something as well. So it's really dangerous, and we're not going to put up with it.
I think the challenge.
A lien notice that there was a tax lien against the property. And he got word to the family down in Tule Lake that, hey, we got to pay this tax off. They weren't able to pay the taxes. And so they would lose the property. And it was noticed by my uncle, who was in Army uniform. And you know, that's why my grandfather wanted me to see that. It was a stake in the American dream that he would lose. And you know, terrible. That's what happened to a lot of people. Not everybody lost their property. Some had, you know, good neighbors, but you know, this is the kind of thing. You know, that property was a $2,500 purchase. I speculate now it's more like $25–30 million. That intergenerational wealth that was not realized.
I visited, not too long ago, I visited Hyde Park, FDR's home on the Hudson River. I assume many of you have been there as well. Beautiful property. I was pleased that they had a small exhibit about the Japanese incarceration. I was a little bit surprised, but I was pleased to see that. Now, at the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C., right on the tidal basin where the famous cherry trees are, there's no mention of the Japanese incarceration or FDR's role in it. FDR was a complicated, contradictory figure. I'm going to ask Chris this question and pose this tough question to Chris. He signed Executive Order 9066 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, as we know, which incarcerated 120,000 Japanese Americans against their will in these camps that Mr. Takano and I know so well, and where our relatives were kept. But a year later, FDR signs the law repealing the Chinese Exclusion Act. So you have these two events, this dichotomy of events 1 year apart from each other. Chris, tough question to you. How should we think about FDR and his legacy given the context of his actions in both of these events?
I mean, look, that's a hard question. I mean, there's been a complete revisionist look at all presidents. I mean, I'm a graduate of Princeton University. We've essentially stricken Woodrow Wilson's name off of everything, and we can have a broader question about whether that makes sense or not. I mean, let me answer it this way. I mean, governments do bad things in the name of protecting people, or governments overreach. I mean, look, we know all too well in this city the Patriot Act following 9/11. There were important steps that were taken in there to protect our countries, but we, you know, went too far in terms of government surveillance of innocent people. And so I'm not going to comment on FDR's legacy other than say, where I started at the beginning, this is important for the American people to be vigilant. It's us as policymakers to sort of stand up and do the right thing. And sometimes doing the right thing is very unpopular along the way.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take this opportunity to just let you guys know that we will be taking some questions for our panelists. What we are going to do is, I think Michael and his team will be handing some pieces of paper and pencils. If you could write your question, that will, at the end of our panel, we will get to some of those questions, and obviously we want to hear from you guys as well. I'm going to stick with Chris. You were talking earlier about this balance, this balancing act, you know, when it comes to thinking about an even playing field for America as it relates to China on the economy, as we think about our patriotism. I mean, how do you, just taking it a step further, how do you balance our patriotism? Obviously, we want the U.S. economy to be a thriving place and to be competing on an even level with perhaps our biggest economic threat, China. How do we balance that with some of the rhetoric that debate tends to generate against Asian Americans?
God, I got all the hard questions. I mean, look, we could probably do an entire session about U.S.-China relations and where we are, economically and militarily, whether there is really a level playing field trading between the two countries at this point. Again, I'd simply say this, which is we need to celebrate in our country our diversity. We need to celebrate the heritage of people that have come here and what Asian Americans have literally built this country. And yet, throughout history, when things get bad, we are pointed to as somehow the scapegoats. And I just can't stress that enough. I mean, I think about 4 years ago, in the middle of a pandemic, these phrases, Kung flu, China virus, coming out of the White House. And we know what that meant. We saw that here in New York City. We saw that in San Francisco where elderly Asian Americans were being pushed to the ground. We saw Asian kids being taunted on the school grounds. We saw Asian doctors and nurses being rejected by the people they were helping. So we know what this history is. And so again, I can't, it's hard to balance where the genuine security interests come in versus patriotism, but we just know the story and it's important for all of us. And this is not a political statement. We just need to be vigilant and we need to keep speaking out on this.
Question for Ms. Meng in transitioning to the COVID pandemic, which Chris just alluded to. We saw during the pandemic a rise in hate language, hate acts directed towards AANHPI individuals. Stop AAPI Hate, this new group that came on the scene during the pandemic, said that they had documented 11,000 hate acts against AAPI individuals, an astounding number. You and Senator Hirono authored and shepherded a bill called the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act through the Congress, and it was signed into law by President Biden, aiming to curb some of these types of hate acts. Can you give us an update about, first of all, tell us what your bill did, and your law, it's now law, what your law did, and then is it working? Are we seeing any sort of progress as a result of that legislation?
Well, the bill, first, I do want to thank the Biden-Harris administration because soon after, minutes or hours after the tragedies in Atlanta happened, I and other KPAC Congressional Caucus members got calls from the Biden administration, and they said, we are here for you, whatever you need. How can we help? We are going to make this better. We're going to stop this. And it's one thing for Asians to show up for each other at rallies or events or pushing bills, but it's another thing to have allies who are not Asian stand up for us. And I will never forget that night and the show of support that we felt. And then soon after, to see action behind words, which was really contrasted by our former president, who literally put a target on our backs every single day. I'm not saying this to be political, it's a fact, right? And so I was really grateful. For those of you who know Congress, and including us who work there, bills normally don't pass that quickly. I've been working on some bills since the day I got there, and they haven't seen any movement. But this, to me, demonstrated how much the administration cared about our caucus, the members, and the communities that were being hurt, literally hurt and killed. And so we pushed this bill, and this bill wasn't something that a group of Asians or Asian members sat around a table, drafted, and said, hey, let's get this done. It was a show of, to me, a demonstration of coalition building and allyship that got this across the finish line. It was leaders and members from the Black community, the Jewish community, Arab community, LGBTQ community, who literally came to us and said, we know what hate looks like. We know what discrimination feels like. And these are some of the things that we've been working on. And so we kind of took a snapshot of many of the bills and policies that they've been working on, and we put it into one big bill. So it's really a labor of love from many different communities and how they fought to combat hate in their communities. The bill is comprehensive. It establishes a point person at the Department of Justice to oversee these hate crimes and bias incidents. It creates and expands community programs. We started out with a $30 million new grant that is community-based to help victims, to help people even, address language, what language not to use, to help defendants who are charged with hate crimes, education. It helps establish, give guidance for a national system of reporting. There is no there was only a voluntary system of reporting of hate crimes, right? Before this bill, a city like Los Angeles or Chicago would say to the federal government that 0 hate crimes happened in their city that given year. And as much as we'd like for that to be true, we know that that's not true. So we are still working on this, is in process, but we need to have a national uniform system of reporting these incidents, because without data and without numbers, you can't really fix a problem. So a lot of this is in the process of being worked on. This bill, in some ways, was a victim of its own success, because in days after it passed, you know, people were so happy for like 48 hours. And then, of course, things are still happening, right? It takes time for a bill to be implemented, and it's only one piece of many that needs to happen. And they said, someone shouted a racial slur at my cousin in Michigan. Your bill was supposed to stop all that, right? So the community, in turn, was actually, there were people in the community who are angry. They're like, it didn't stop it, right? So it really mends a lot of gaps that had, were long overdue. And we are making progress, and we are really grateful to the Department of Justice for working closely, not just with law enforcement, but with community-based groups as well.
Thank you. And if you have a question, would you just, so some of the cards did go out. Okay, very good. We will collect some of those cards. And I will wrap up very shortly. One other bill you worked on, Ms. Meng, was legislation aimed at trying to create a museum of a National Asian Pacific American Museum. There's a African American museum on the National Mall. They are in the process of creating a Latino or Hispanic museum, but the Asians are still a little bit further behind. Where are we with that effort, and what's the feasibility of that actually getting built on the National Mall?
The bill that we passed was similar to a bill spearheaded by former Congressman John Lewis for the African American Museum in 1988. In the days after our bill passed, I had someone call me. They were on a bus to DC and asked me where this museum was. I said, again, Congress doesn't work that fast. There is no museum yet. But anyway, so the first step is the study of a bill. There is a commission, equally bipartisan commission that is almost fully appointed. It will take 18 months for them to study anything from venue to costs to logistics. And so we are in the very beginning stages of this museum building process. But I will take a moment to two things. One, I had that bill for many years, almost when I first started in Congress, and people were not interested in anything like this. We couldn't get any movement on it. And then all of a sudden, because of the pandemic and the Stop Asian Hate period during the pandemic, Senator Schumer, I have to give him credit, and please tell him I gave him credit because he'll love that. I mentioned this bill to him at a rally. He's also proud that he attended more Stop Anti-Asian Hate rallies than probably me. He loves to say that in New York. But he said, oh, you have this bill, let's get it done. And I'm like, okay. And weeks later, it was done, right? So sometimes, unfortunately, it takes really sad and dark moments in our life for progress to be made. And as a New Yorker, I want to say the first time I came to MOCA, I was very emotional because I came as a young adult. I never knew that this place existed. I'm all the way out in Queens. But I never knew it existed. And to come here and see on the walls the history of people that look like me and foods and culture that I could relate to was like earth-shattering to me. And that's in a diverse city like New York. So we want the museum to represent Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians. It's going to be really difficult, but it's going to be a really big tent.
And let me segue. Chris talked about this idea as Asian Americans we have felt over generations of being invisible, right? In that photo of the railroad, we don't exist, right? And my counterpoint is that, no, actually we were there. We were being debated in the halls of Congress. We were being debated with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the White House. When you look back at the record, there was a huge debate in Washington over what to do about, the Japanese problem after, in the middle of World War II after Pearl Harbor, right? At the Pentagon, or it was then called the War Department, in the halls of Congress. We're in the Congressional Record, and in the record in the executive branch as well. So let me ask Mr. Takano, thinking about this museum, this future museum on the National Mall, if you could design one exhibit about AANHPI history that is not in the textbooks. As a former public school teacher and educator, if there's something out there, that a story about our history that has not been told, what would that exhibit look like?
Well, our story, the story's been told, but it's the matter of how many people have heard it. And so it's a matter of having the reach that we need. So, it's in a paragraph or two of history books about the Chinese laborers on the western portion of the railroad being built, the Transcontinental Railroad. There's now a portion in many textbooks about Japanese American internment or incarceration, as we know. Incarceration is more the word people are using now. So I think of this museum as an opportunity to amplify these stories. And for Asian Americans, I see people coming to see, the African American Museum is one of the most popular museums that my constituents want to go see. And I remember when it first opened, and it's one of the top draws for tourism. And so really I see the work that Grace is doing and is leading is very important, so that we are able to amplify all of these stories so that people know about the contributions that the various AAPI immigrant populations gave. I just want to take a moment to kind of address this question about the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in the middle of 1943.
Sure.
I can just take a speculation, I guess. The country was at war with Japan, and the Chinese were our allies. And this was a very practical way to appeal to an important ally. We were fighting, on two different fronts. So, Roosevelt is one of my important, actually writing a report on Roosevelt was what got me into politics as a 5th grader. And his contradictions, I know about how Eleanor Roosevelt went and argued with him and said, you shouldn't do this to the Japanese Americans. And not only did Eleanor Roosevelt do that, it was his Attorney General, Francis Biddle. And believe it or not, when I was about to go speak at an LGBTQ day at the FBI, I was going to say something bad about J. Edgar Hoover. But in this case, J. Edgar Hoover actually told the president that there's no reason, there's no evidence that the Japanese populations pose any real threat to the country. So why did this president do that? Why did he sign this order? There was enormous political pressure coming from none other than Earl Warren, the governor of California, who would become our amazing Chief Justice, who would write the order to integrate the schools. A very unracist thing to do, but the Hearst newspapers were like, Fox News of the day, but even worse. He had this huge concentration of newspapers that whipped up wartime hysteria. So the politicians were dealing with the political pressures of the tremendous newspaper chain, the Hearst newspaper chain at the time, and there was a political demand. And the one governor that stood up to this, Governor of Colorado, he would lose his election, to give you an idea. So political survival was first on the minds of people. And I'll make one other point. It was a failure of political leadership. Our Constitution was our Constitution. It was the failure of political leaders to stand up for what was right. So leadership makes a difference. Leadership makes a huge difference. Think about a principal of a school, and all of us know about what it means to go to a school and be taunted because of what we look like. Chinese, Japanese, look at all this little thing. And think about if the principal of the school was endorsing that and getting laughs from all of the other kids. Well, what do you think standing up in front of an audience and calling the COVID-19 virus the Kung flu? I'm sure all of us felt that we were back in intermediate school but you know what? I'm even thinking intermediate school kids today, most of them know right and wrong. But the problem is if you have a principal of a school who is cheerleading this kind of language, that's a real problem. Think about if you have a president of the United States that gives license to what was previously a social taboo. We have a lot of, I think, making taboo certain things again, because certain things are out of the box and have become normalized. And I also thank our current president for showing that kind of leadership, reaching out to Grace Meng and saying, what can we do about it? And of course, a bill can't change everything overnight, but it changes the whole tone. And a change in tone makes a huge difference, and that's what a leader is primarily able to do.
I think we heard a couple ideas for exhibits, and you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt, and I also know that there is a famous photo of Eleanor Roosevelt visiting the Gila River, Arizona incarceration camp where my grandparents were incarcerated. So that could be part of the feature as well. Did any of you guys, Grace Meng or Chris Liu, have ideas for a future exhibit that maybe captures what hasn't been told about the AAPI story?
I was glad that you asked Mark, because that was a hard question. I don't know if this is an exhibit idea, but one thing that I've thought about a lot over the years is that we are lucky in places like New York and California to have strong, vibrant Asian American communities where when we are going through tough times and celebrations, that we have each other to lean on. But I often think about, and I've spent a little time visiting some of them, about Asian Americans living in areas where there are not a lot of other Asian Americans. When you're the only Asian kid in a school and you're bullied, right, during the pandemic, what do you do and who do you turn to? Or when there's a grandma in the middle of America who, you know, her family sends her treats to celebrate Lunar New Year and she has no one to celebrate with and she has to eat it by herself in hiding in her apartment, right? Those are the stories that I hope we can highlight too, because it's not just these larger cities with vibrant Asian populations. It's so many of the ones in more with smaller Asian populations that might not have had anyone to turn to.
Chris, you want?
You know, I think a lot about, now my wonderful niece is back here, is 26 years old, is probably too young to know many of the harmful Asian stereotypes that have been perpetuated by the entertainment industry. And I think that's something that needs to be told. Go back and look at some of those old movies. Look at Peter Sellers playing Fu Manchu. Look at the Dragon Lady stereotype. One of the most wonderful movies, Breakfast at Tiffany's with Audrey Hepburn, has a horrible, horrible characterization of an Asian man played by Mickey Rooney. All of that matters. The fact that I think for most of us, we remember the show Kung Fu, the guy's played by a white person, David Carradine. And so all of those stereotypes contribute to the perception that still lasts among many people about what the Asian community is like. So I think we need to tell that very ugly side of the story as well. I also think we need to tell the story of allyship. And I say this all the time. Asian Americans marched with Dr. King. Asian Americans marched with Cesar Chavez. The civil rights movement that helped blacks, that helped Latinos, helped Asian Americans as well. And this idea that somehow we are different from other people of color is absolutely not true. We are one with all of them, and we cannot separate them. Our gains are their gains are our gains as well. And I think that story of allyship needs to be told.
And for members of the museum and people who are involved with this museum, I think you guys are aware that there's a yellow face exhibit in the back that when I was here on my last visit that I checked out, and encourage all of you to check out as well if you haven't seen it. And we're glad that the museum is shining a light on that aspect of Hollywood as well. I'm going to turn now to your audience questions, and maybe we'll stay with Chris here. I don't know who asked this question, but it says, my concern is, what is the proactive strategy to deal with the intentional targeting of Asian Americans as a perpetual foreigner, as Asian Americans become the fastest growing minority in the United States, which is true by percentage, and as both parties target China in the upcoming presidential election. We touched on a little bit of this, but Chris, any thoughts on what we can do as Asian Americans to be proactive about countering the targeting of Asian Americans?
Look, I'm not going to get political here, so let me simply say this. You know, growing up, my father taught me that no matter what you have achieved in life, no matter how wealthy you become, no matter how educated you are, the very first thing people look at is your face. And I honestly believe, I think there are far too many people in our community that believe that they have assimilated and that these hurtful stereotypes, these racial slurs somehow don't apply to us. They apply to all of us. And they apply to us whether you are actually Chinese, whether you're Korean, whether you simply look like them. And so I think it is incumbent upon all of us to call out those politicians on both sides of the aisle when they do this. And it's to vote for people like Grace and Mark and support them so that they can be our representative. And it's to support, you know, Asian American journalists who are going to tell these stories as well. I feel like I'm being kind of a downer on all this, but I do believe things are changing. We kind of go up and down. But having now just talked about some of those really hurtful stereotypes that we've seen in the media, It is amazing that in any industry, any walk of life right now in American society, you can point to Asian Americans who are succeeding and who are literally household figures. I was saying this the other day. I mean, it is amazing that there is a Marvel superhero who is Asian American, and that in Barbie there is an Asian Ken. I mean, like, that would have been unthinkable 10, 20 years ago. So I think that is progress, and I think when people see more of us in positions of leadership, that makes a difference.
I have that Simu figure on my shelf. It's very cool. Dennis from East West Bank writes, where's Dennis? Okay, hey Dennis. Thank you, Congressman Takano, Congresswoman Meng, and Ambassador Liu for your voice and visibility representing AAPIs in public office. Question, what initiatives, efforts are in place for the AAPI public officials to promote and encourage the next generation of Asian Americans to enter public office and to become leaders?
Well, actually, I am the chair of ASPIRE, which is the political arm of our Congressional Asian Caucus. We always have a list of AAPI candidates running for federal office. I'm not trying to be political, but that you are welcome to get and welcome to kind of get support for. We want to increase our numbers in the House and the Senate. We have 21 Congress members that are Asian, and we are looking to, help elect more. We have a long list of members who are running, and that also is true. Asian Americans, I believe, I read an article that said in the last cycle or last year or two that Asian American candidates grew at the highest rate than any other demographic. So more Asian Americans than ever are running for office, are volunteering in campaigns, and getting involved. And so we just have to continue to push that. We're the fastest growing community in this country, but that's not true of our voting rate. And so that needs to happen, and we have a chance to demonstrate that this November.
And Mr. Takano, if I could follow up, what is the pipeline for young people who want to get involved in politics and maybe eventually lead to a career in the government, in Congress, or in the administration? But is there sort of a natural pipeline of progression?
Well, I think I'll state what I think has been a very successful route for many, has been fellowships, like the fellowships and internships that are actually supported financially by organizations like APEX, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Study. I think the Japanese American Citizen League also funds internships in Washington. I don't know whether the other AAPI organizations do, but I know APEX definitely does. I have had several interns come to my office. Sometimes they only stay for like a few months because they get jobs, and that's how. These are very competitive. So if you land one of these, the reputation I think for APEX fellows is extremely high. I can think of my legislative staffers right now. Two of them. I mean, most of us only have like two staffers and two legislative staffers as well as a legislative director. Both of them were APEX fellows. Well, look, my point is that these fellowships and internships are very effective ways. Sometimes university systems will have Washington, D.C. programs. At California, we have something called UC-DC, University of California in D.C.
I did that program.
Did you really?
Yeah, that's how I ended up in Washington.
You're an example of that pipeline.
Yeah.
Often that staff experience will mean they won't stay there. Some will build a career. Some will take that experience and decide to move back to their communities and start a political career based on that experience. So that's one way to do it. The other is to, as I always tell young people who are interested, they want to know how to become an elected official. I say location, location, location. Where is your community? What is the political community that you want to commit yourself to? Other than, if you're a super wealthy person that wants to just buy your seat, which is what happens to some people. They try to do that. I don't like that particularly. I do admire those people who go back to their community, run for a local office. I know Grace worked her way up. I worked my way up that way. And you build credibility, trust, and